Hey guys, Mrs. Cozen here, and these are going to be some really quick notes. You guys know a lot of this vocabulary already. This is going to be ecology. This is going to be your first video, and it is going to be, you guys can call this chapter 3. This is the first video, or the only video that you guys are going to have in segment 1. So the first thing we have to talk about in ecology is just some of the common vocabulary terms that you've probably heard a little bit about before, or quite a bit about before, and then how do those work in a food chain and then a food web. Okay, so let's talk about what does ecology mean. Ecology means the study of interactions between living things and their environment. So this means the living and the non-living parts of the environment. We're going to talk mostly about the living parts today, and then in segment 2, chapter 4, we're going to talk about the non-living parts. Okay, so we're going to start with organization of living things. This is just something that you guys are revisiting from the very beginning of the year. When we did characteristics of life, we did how is life organized from the largest level, the biosphere that contains everything else, all the way down to the smallest cell and molecule. We're just going to go from the biosphere down to one single organism. Okay, so biosphere is all the living parts of the planet. This includes plants, fungi, bacteria, animals, and in your animals, that includes reptiles, fish, mammals, everything. So this is just the living part of the planet. And then later on, we're going to talk about how does that living part interact with the non-living part to create ecological interactions, which we're going to talk about in segment 2. Right below biosphere is ecosystem. So your biosphere is made up of different ecosystems. Think like the Amazon rainforest is an ecosystem. It includes both the living and non-living parts of one specific environment that have like precipitation, temperature, species in common. So you've got the biosphere contains all the ecosystems on our planet. And we only know of one biosphere so far. That's our biosphere, our living sphere, or our living planet. Okay, underneath ecosystems, you have communities. So a community is all the living parts of an ecosystem. Okay, so the definition I have there is groups of populations living in the same area. So if your ecosystem is the Amazon rainforest, then your communities would be all the living species within that rainforest. Obviously, an area with a lot of biodiversity, whereas something like a desert would have a much smaller community. It's all the living parts that live in the same area. So ecosystem is both living and non-living. Community is just the living parts. Population is a group of all the same species in one area. So in the Amazon rainforest, that just might be one species of river otter or one species of tree or plant. All the species that live in one area. So think of them almost as sort of a gene pool if you want to go back to what we just talked about in evolution. It's one group of all the same species, they can breed together. And then an organism is one living thing. So you have organisms make up populations, okay? Populations make up communities, communities make up ecosystems, and then ecosystems make up the biosphere. And you can see that in this picture right here. So it's taken right out of your book. You can see we have one elk, that's our individual organism. You have a herd of elk that makes up your population. The elk, along with all the other living things in that ecosystem, make up the community. All the living and non-living parts make up the ecosystem. So you're talking all the water sources, you're talking the rocks, you're talking all the geology, all the living and non-living parts. And all of those make up, you guys can skip biome for right now, all of those parts of an ecosystem make up our biosphere. All right, so that's levels of organization. Now, these are the ones that you guys have probably heard quite a bit about before, some of these vocab words. So let's start with autotroph or producer. Remember, they automatically make their own food. They go through the process of photosynthesis. They take energy from the sun, and they create glucose and put out oxygen when they take in carbon dioxide. Okay. And don't forget that the process of photosynthesis uses sunlight to make its own energy. I say this because it's worded that way on your test, and a lot of people forget that photosynthesis. I know we talked about that way in the first semester. Photosynthesis uses sunlight to get energy, and then that energy works its way up through the food chain to provide energy for all the other organisms in the ecosystem. So it's kind of important. So from there, once we have our producers, our autotrophs, once they get their energy from the sun, then that energy can move up the food chain and can be consumed by consumers or heterotrophs. Remember, heterotroph, they eat different things, okay? They get energy outside of themselves, so they have to consume other organisms. This does not always mean carnivores. A heterotroph or a consumer can also be a herbivore. It just means they don't go through photosynthesis. All right, so now these words you've probably definitely heard before. These are all different types of consumers. Herbivore eats plants. Okay, they're only going to eat producers, are the ones who are going to get the most energy from the sun, or they're going to get the most energy in your food chain because they're just one step above that photosynthesis of getting the energy from the sun. Okay, and I picked one of our tortoises here for my picture just to go with what we just talked about in evolution. Carnivore eats other animals. Do not always think of carnivore as a mammal that eats meat. Okay, carnivore is anything that's going to consume other animals. Other animals can also be bugs, worms, snails. It doesn't have to be muscle and meat. It doesn't have to be a steak. Anything that does not feed on plants and solely eats other animals is a carnivore. But don't always think of an animal as something that has muscle in it. Okay, it can be a bug. And then omnivores, you guys can eat both plants and animals. A lot of organisms fall into this category. Bears are a good example. They'll eat nuts and berries, but a huge amount of their protein comes from salmon and fish. Okay, and this is just my silly comic that shows herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, and omnivore. Haha. All right, these two, it's really important that you guys understand the difference between them. This is called a detritivore. They eat dead material. So these are going to be your animals that are breaking down dead things. You guys can think like a vulture, although they're getting a little big to be a detritivore, but that's very often the first thing we think of. Think crabs, earthworms, snails. Think roly-poly bugs. Anything that you can lift up, like a decaying log in the woods, and you see little bugs and worms in the bottom of it. Those are detritivores. Okay, they eat dead and decaying material and break it down. Now, the other side of that, a decomposer. We very often get detritivores and detritivores and decomposers confused. Say that 50 times fast. Decomposers are going to break down living material in order to actually get their energy. And the organisms that are going to do this are most likely bacteria and fungi. There are some worms, very small worms, that will do this. But decomposers don't just eat dead stuff. They eat dead stuff and break it down into something that we can actually use. Those worms and crabs and mites that I was talking about before, they break down material, but they just turn it into their own waste. It's not actually something that's used again in the soil. Decomposers are going to actually take material and break it down into carbon or oxygen, break it down into its molecular components so that it can be go back into the carbon or the nitrogen cycle. And almost there, food chain. I'm sure you guys have seen food chains before. This one eats this one, eats this one, eats this one, eats this one. Okay, and then you can see your decomposers here breaking down your top level consumer. Food chains, very basic, not a really good representation of how feeding relationships actually work in an environment. Okay, they're much more complicated than that. So that's what we use a food web for. A food web is a whole bunch of different food chains all put together, because very often organisms don't just eat one thing like you see here. They'll very often eat a variety of different things. So if it's a carnivore, it's going to eat a lot of different smaller organisms. Okay, if it's a herbivore, it'll eat a lot of different kinds of plants. So a food web is a much more accurate representation of our ecosystem. It shows all the interconnected feeding relationships. So you can see here, the owl is going to eat these two things as its carnivore, but you guys can see there's multiple food chains that make up just this small feeding relationship right here. Okay, food web is much more accurate, and that's what we're going to focus on. And your last note, guys, these are vocabulary words to apply to the different steps in a food web. Okay, they can also apply to a food chain, but from here on out, we're going to be talking about food webs. Okay, we start with your producers. They're going to use photosynthesis to get energy from the sun. Primary consumers are your herbivores. Secondary consumers are usually going to be your small carnivores or your omnivores. And then tertiary or top level consumers are going to be usually your top level carnivores, sometimes omnivores as well. Okay, so you guys need to draw this triangle as well. Okay, that's the end of your chapter 3 notes, your first set of notes in ecology. Thank you so much, guys.